Congressman Arrington.
Mr. Chairman, it's an honor to be here. It's good to see you. Like I said earlier, I enjoyed working with you on the Ag Committee with respect to the 2018 Farm Bill. I have to say that because I am from the food, fuel, and fiber capital of the world, West Texas, and I'm proud to work with Democrats and Republicans to do well by our farmers and our food supply and everybody that eats and benefits from food safety and food security, which is a national security issue. I respect you, and I have tremendous respect for Mr. Byers. I know some of my colleagues are going to find some of my comments harsh and directed to their party, but I want to say from the outset, both Republicans and Democrats have contributed to what I believe is the biggest threat to my children's future in this country. I'll say it again. Your party, Mr. Chairman, and the party I represent have contributed to a completely unsustainable debt proposition for the current fiscal state of affairs and for the future and the path that we're on. It is scary, and it will knock the shine right off of America. It will rob our children of the freedoms and the blessed opportunities we've had in this country. No one knows exactly when that debt crisis occurs and what it looks like, but when the dominoes fall, sir, we're not going to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. We can't bail out of that crisis. We can't borrow our way out of that crisis. And we can't print enough money to save the country in such a dire and catastrophic scenario. I think it's appropriate to look to our founding fathers as wise counsel, as they forewarned us and our leadership for the great United States with respect to the position that we're currently in, again, contributed by both parties. And I don't know that there's been a more visceral set of warnings from our founding fathers from the outset than the one with respect to our national debt. I've just got a few here, but I think it's appropriate. My favorite is James Madison, who said, "A public debt is a public curse, and in a Republican government, a greater curse than any other." Pretty bold words. Ben Franklin said that when you run in debt, you give to another power over your liberty. He said the second vice in public service is lying. Mr. Perlmutter, but he said the first is running up a debt. Because you're my friend. And I'm expecting one of my Democrat colleagues to be reasonable here, and I'm thinking you may be just that person today. Can you attest, Ms. Torres, that he is not? To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. Mr. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, nothing can more affect national prosperity than a constant and systematic attention to extinguishing the present debt and to avoid as much as possible the incurring of any new debt. And then in George Washington, our first president's farewell address, he warns us in hindsight with his experiences and his wisdom what could be the big threats to this more perfect union. And he said foreign influence, and he said factions that divide us and weaken the bonds that tie us in the e pluribus unum and in our common cause of liberty. But he also mentions fiscal irresponsibility. And just to paraphrase, he said, we must likewise avoid the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertion in time of peace to discharge the debt which unavoidable wars may have occasioned, not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. Avoid debt. Sometimes you'll have to rack up some debt to fight a war. But when you're not fighting a war and in extraordinary times with extraordinary means, you should be paying down that debt, or you curse the next generation with a debt that we're not willing to pay. Simply, we're not willing to pay it. I appreciate your remarks, Mr. Chairman, about trying to get out of here quickly, and I'm not trying to filibuster here. I think there is an inevitable outcome. I'm not sure that I'm eloquent enough to convince anyone that has not made their mind up already about lifting the debt ceiling without making any changes to this profligate spending that is happening, or some provision for future reining in of our debt to GDP and reducing our debt with some fiscal measure, some control, some budget reform, some consideration for the future. While Democrats, in a partisan way, it's happened on both sides, have prioritized these things. You can defend them, you will defend them, but where are the things to take care of the future? That we don't leave our children in such a deep debt hole they can never crawl out of it. I appreciate what you said about throwing us off course, but if I could, I would throw us off course. Not to create a risk to the good faith and credit of the United States and a default, but so that we can do what I think debt limit votes and the debt limit provision was intended to do: pause and take inventory of the fiscal condition of this country and the path that we're on. And I can't think of anything more devastating. I really cannot. And my 3 points, Mr. Chairman, for why I encourage my Democrat friends and my Republican colleagues to hit pause and do something responsible for our grandchildren and children, to really dig deep on this, are really threefold here. It's a process problem that I have. It's a policy issue that I have and price tag that is associated with those policies. And it is a full-on punting and passing the buck in terms of not including some fiscal reform measure. In the past, I have a list of times when we came together and raised the debt ceiling and said, but we're going to reduce deficits by $500 billion. We're going to balance the budget in the 1990s as we lift the debt ceiling. We're going to have a bicameral, bipartisan committee to look at our broken process that results in broken outcomes, and it will time and time again until we reap the whirlwind, unless we get the incentives right to force us to do the right thing. The thing that every country, that every state and every local government, every private sector enterprise and every family has to do, which is live within their means. So the process, I think, stinks. And I've said it, we've gone it alone as Republicans. You're going it alone as Democrats. But I think this is different, and I welcome your challenges to this supposition. But you've had 2 years since we suspended the debt limit. And again, the Democrat leadership has had 2 years to come up with and to anticipate how we might lift the debt ceiling by working together over the past several months, certainly by not waiting to the eve of default to come to this very place, especially after $500 billion almost in a stopgap measure to give time so that it could be considered in one of the reconciliation, I guess I'd say the second partisan reconciliation legislation. There have been two partisan reconciliation bills that need zero Republican input, that have received no Republican input or support or vote or even amendments that we offered by the thousands, say hundreds, but it's over 1,000. Not one has been taken. That's your prerogative. You got to defend this to the country. You will defend it to the country. But to drive and jam the largest tax and spend bill in the history of our country, the largest expansion of the welfare system and entitlements, and some without work requirements being repealed, the largest expansion of our government. I would say the most radical reimagination of our government's role in the lives of its people. That's what I would say. But nevertheless, you went after this on your own. And you didn't need a single Republican vote. And why you wait to the eve of default and not put this measure in place in one of these reconciliation packages is, it defies my understanding. So I think that I think the process is untenable and indefensible. And I think it puts Republicans in a position to say, we've done it together, we've held hands and we've jumped, and it wasn't comfortable because we all have to own our current condition and our unsustainable path. But we've never seen this massive of partisan spending bills that have come across the transom in this body, ever. And you're not going to get Republicans to support that. Secondly, the policies. I call them progressive policies. I mean, we've had, like I said, 2 years since we suspended it, a whole several months, almost a year now, where Democrat leadership could have prioritized this, but instead they were able to basically take the entire waterfront of the federal government. I mean, welfare programs, health care, energy policies, it's mind-boggling. The tax code, it's an endless list of mostly progressive policies, and the price tag is incalculable. And instead of focusing on this with respect to getting it included or having measures that would reduce the debt and deficit in the future, would have been a responsible thing to do. Again, you have to defend it. I think it's indefensible. And I don't think you're surprised that Republicans aren't willing to go along with you without some change to the current construct. And I'm disappointed, quite frankly, that Leader McConnell gave that lever up, because this is it before we release this thing without any opportunity to make changes, to dial it back, and to consider the fact that we're $29 trillion in debt. We're at 100% debt to GDP, the highest since World War II. We ain't in a war. And the trajectory going forward is mind-blowing. We doubled the debt over the last 10 years. I'll say we. The next 10 years, the projections are it will double again. In 30 years, at the rate we're going without the BBB, Reconciliation Tax and Spend Bill, we're talking about $112 trillion in additional debt, Jamie. $112 trillion If the CBO is off 1 point on interest, that's $30 trillion more. That, my friends, is 200% of debt to GDP. That's twice the size of our economy, of the debt load that we're carrying. The interest rate, the interest that we're paying today, close to half a trillion, it'll be over $1 trillion in 10 years. Before COVID, we were paying $1 trillion in deficit spending, borrowing $1 trillion over what we brought in revenue, pay for the government that we were offering to the American people. How do you get your mind around that? Does it scare you for the future of our country? If it does, I don't see how you could move forward with this kind of spending and this kind of debt and deficit accumulation. The last point, again, is this idea of when we've done things in the past, we've worked together to, and there's a list of them, I won't go through them all, but the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act of 1985, that we could start there in sort of modern history, and there was a trade-off for the debt ceiling vote and a balanced budget a few years out with mandatory cuts if we weren't able to get there. That was passed on a bipartisan basis. There were other balance the budget or automatic spending cut measures after that. There was the pay-go that was created. There was the statutory pay-go that was signed into law by President Obama, along with the Simpson-Bowles super committee to try to figure out a way out of this together so we could feel good about the future of our country and our children's future in this country. And there's a long list here, but they are all trade-offs, and they were all recognizing this threat to our country, and they were included in debt ceiling conversations, which we haven't had, and in debt ceiling votes. So after COVID hit, Chairman, I knew we were going to have to spend some money, or we would sustain a recession that would put us in a worse situation. I got with one of your colleagues, Scott Peters, and 30 Democrats and 30 Republicans, and we sent a letter to the four corners, and we implored them, we know we have to spend some money, but as we do it, let's take care to put reforms in place to deal with the consequences of this and the future debt that we're going to put on our children. We had several meetings, a long list of bipartisan reform proposals. Spending cap and reforming the enforcement mechanisms that don't seem to work around here even when we pass something. Debt targets, we just introduced that, Scott Peters and I. Debt commissions that focus on mandatory spending that's driving it. Also looking at the insolvency of some of our safety nets for seniors. More transparency in CBO scoring, no budget, no recess. At one time there was a no budget, no pay. It passed. But you know what? We are Houdini when it comes to getting out of the very things that we put on us to get us to act responsibly. And it turns out that the Senate passed a budget and the House passed a budget at that time, but they didn't pass a joint budget, but that wasn't required. So nothing came of it, and they didn't have to leave with less pay. So there are plenty of ideas that are bipartisan. These are just the ones that I have worked on with my colleagues that would change the root cause of our dysfunction and the terrible, irresponsible, reckless outcomes. But none of these were are in this debt ceiling vote. And I don't think we've had a serious or meaningful conversation about these in this entire process. That's unbelievable to me. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the floor, but obviously I think this is treacherous path, and I think it's a total disaster to spend this kind of money. And I'm not even commenting on the inflation that has resulted in the partisan spending measures, and I'm happy to go into that. I mean, IMF just put out a press release just a while ago saying, where is it in here? The United States is tied for the fastest rate of rising prices among 35 advanced economies, according to the International Monetary Fund and their own data. $377 a month that people are losing and having their wages relative to inflation drop, so they're having a tough time living paycheck to paycheck when their paycheck doesn't have the purchasing power it used to. But I'm not going to go off on the tangent of some of these policies that I think are going to prolong our recession at best and really be destructive of the prospect of future prosperity in the country. I welcome any questions and comments, and I'm grateful that you gave me the opportunity to share my concerns.
You're always welcome here. We